Back in 2006, in the Russian city of Ekaterinburg, a woman went looking for her daughter at a friend's apartment. She kept knocking, kept ringing the bell, but nobody answered. A few days later, police had no choice but to break the door down. What they found inside that apartment that day was something nobody there would ever forget. Almost every part of the place looked like a crime scene. Inside the apartment were the bodies of 3 people: Svetlana, her 7-year-old daughter, and another child. All 3 had been assaulted before they were killed, and the murders themselves were unbelievably brutal. Even experienced homicide detectives later admitted they had never seen anything like it before. The case would eventually become one of the most terrifying and longest-running murder investigations in Russia. For more than 9 years, police tried to track the killer down, but failed every single time. And while investigators were desperately searching for him, that man was still out there, moving from city to city, continuing to murder women in horrific ways. The killer we're talking about today had several different names, but one nickname stuck more than the others: the Black Tenant. But why were locals calling him that? And how did a man who openly mocked the police manage to stay free for over 9 years? It all started when the owner of a rental apartment began worrying about her tenants. Nobody had heard from them in over 10 days, and they weren't answering their phones either. When the landlady finally went to check on the apartment herself, she noticed a horrible smell before she even reached the door. She kept ringing the bell. Nothing. Eventually, she unlocked the door with her spare key and walked inside. At first, the apartment just looked messy. Everything was thrown around, completely trashed. But the moment Maria Nikishina opened the bathroom door, she nearly collapsed from shock. Inside the bathtub was the body of a young woman floating in the water, her mouth taped shut. Detectives quickly realized this wasn't a suicide. The victim had visible injuries all over her body, and later, forensic experts confirmed she had been sexually assaulted before her death. The cause of death was strangulation. The killer had choked her to death. Investigators estimated she'd been dead for about a week before anyone found her. Police questioned the landlady right away. She explained that she had rented the apartment to a man, but she had no idea who the dead woman in the bathtub was. And that immediately raised a huge question. What was the connection between the victim and the tenant? Was the tenant another victim himself? Or was he the killer who had disappeared? Maria Nikishina told investigators the man had introduced himself as Oleg Lusev. He claimed he was from Chelyabinsk and had moved there for work. According to him, he worked as a carpenter. He rented the apartment for 2 months, but neighbors later said he suddenly disappeared only 3 days after moving in. Now police were looking at 2 possibilities. Either the tenant had become a victim himself, or he was the fugitive killer they were searching for. Detectives started looking for a man named Oleg Lusev, around 30 to 35 years old, supposedly from Chelyabinsk. But very quickly they discovered something strange. That person didn't exist. The identity was completely fake. According to the lead investigator, fake names like that were often used by criminals who constantly moved between cities committing crimes. Luckily, the landlady remembered the tenant's face really well, and police were able to create a composite sketch based on her description. At the same time, investigators were still trying to figure out who the murdered woman was. They checked missing persons reports, but none of them matched the victim. So the search got bigger. Families of missing women were brought in one by one to look through the victim's belongings. And there were a lot of families, dozens of them. Then finally, detectives got a break. One of the men who came in recognized a bracelet. He told investigators he had bought it for his wife years earlier during a trip, and ever since then, she never took it off. But it wasn't just the bracelet. Later, he also identified his wife through her clothes and facial reconstruction images. And finally, the victim had a name. Right after that, the husband was brought in for questioning. He explained that on April 1st, the 2 of them had gotten into an argument. According to him, his wife left the house to calm down and never came back. Just a few hours later, she was lying dead inside that apartment. But what really happened that day? And who was responsible for such a brutal murder? There was something else about the case that immediately stood out to investigators. Not a single male fingerprint was found anywhere inside the apartment, which meant the killer had carefully wiped down everything he'd touched. But even with all that caution, he still made one small mistake. Detectives couldn't find anything useful inside the rooms themselves. But when they searched the trash, they found a liquor bottle and a few plastic cups that still had fingerprints on them. The moment those prints were entered into the system, investigators were hit with a shocking realization. The man they were looking for was already a wanted serial killer. For more than 5 years, police departments across Russia had been trying to catch him. His name was Oleg Anatolyevich Zaykin, born in 1972. Most of the crimes connected to him involved rape, torture, and extremely violent murders. People had started calling him the Chikatilo of the Urals, because Zaykin seemed determined to outdo even Russia's most infamous serial killers. The level of violence, the sadistic way he treated his victims, had basically become his signature. Almost every murder involved brutal torture and prolonged abuse. As soon as police confirmed his identity, authorities in Orenburg sent his full description to law enforcement units across the country. Under distinguishing features, the report said he had a scar on his left hand, and the knuckle on the ring finger of his right hand was missing. It also mentioned something else investigators had noticed. He almost always introduced himself as a carpenter. And there was another strange pattern. After every murder, even if he was hiding in a completely different city, Zaykin would change his appearance. Sometimes he shaved his head. Sometimes he changed his beard or hairstyle. Then he'd quietly disappear again before police could catch up to him. Investigators started questioning anyone who might have seen him. Train station employees, long-distance bus drivers, pretty much anyone who crossed paths with travelers. First, nothing useful came up. Then finally, they found an important witness, a taxi driver. The driver told police that one of his passengers had been unusually talkative. The man introduced himself as a carpenter and said he was only staying in Orenburg temporarily before heading to Ufa, the capital of Bashkortostan. The moment investigators heard that, every police department in Ufa was warned that a serial killer who had avoided capture for years might be heading toward their city. Authorities even used television broadcasts and newspapers to warn the public. But there was one major problem. How were they supposed to catch a man who always seemed to outsmart police and disappear without a trace? Oleg Zaykin was born in 1972 in the region of Buryatia, in the village of Zygrevo, about 65 kilometers from Ulan-Ude. On the surface, his family seemed completely normal. Hardworking, respectable. His father worked in a factory, and his mother was a teacher. Oleg's childhood appeared fairly calm. Nobody bullied him. Nobody abused him. But over time, his real behavior slowly started to show. He was isolated, barely talked to anyone, and constantly stole things. Then things got worse. He started setting fire to people's front doors. School wasn't going any better either. His grades were terrible, and eventually he had to repeat a year. Still, there was one thing he was genuinely interested in: electronics and radios. At one point, he became so obsessed with getting a certain part that he decided to steal his neighbor's tape recorder. But he got caught almost immediately. After that, his name ended up in the juvenile police system. From that point on, authorities kept him under supervision. His father was forced to constantly keep an eye on him. Sometimes he even walked him all the way to night school himself. When Zaykin turned 20, he was sent to the military. At one point during his service, he tried to take his own life. Later, he claimed he had been sexually assaulted by other soldiers, but investigators never found any evidence to support the story. Eventually, the army discharged him because of behavioral problems and sent him back home. A decision that would later turn out to be one of the biggest mistakes made by everyone responsible for evaluating his mental state. Because after he came back, the violence inside him became impossible to ignore. Years later, Zaykin admitted that he enjoyed hurting people. At one point, he took all of his rage out on one of his girlfriends and brutally tortured her. After that, almost every woman who entered a relationship with him ended up becoming a victim of severe abuse. When he returned from the military, his father managed to get him a job at the same factory where he himself had worked for years. But it didn't take long for Oleg to start causing problems there too. Together with a few of his friends, he ended up stealing a huge amount of industrial equipment from the factory. For Oleg's father, it was devastating, a humiliation he couldn't handle. Not long after that, he was found dead inside his own home, hanged before his son's trial had even started. At the time, Oleg had been released under travel restrictions. But after his father's suicide, he decided to run. And from that moment on, he basically disappeared from his hometown forever. That's when his real life as a fugitive began. Using fake documents, he moved from city to city, constantly terrified of being recognized by police. Most of the money he lived on came from theft. Then, about a year later, he committed his first murder. In 2001, in Chelyabinsk, the body of a woman named Dinara Kruglova was found inside her apartment. Investigators discovered that Dinara and Oleg had been in a relationship. According to the case files, Zykin attacked her during sex. Later, he claimed he never meant to kill her, that he had simply misjudged the force of the attack. But in the end, the woman died from her injuries. After that murder, Oleg had no choice but to run again. And from that point on, his life turned into a non-stop cycle of crime. Break-ins, rape, torture, murder. After police identified the 2006 victim in Chelyabinsk, investigators became convinced Zykin was heading toward Ufa. But then, on October 12th, an absolutely horrifying triple murder took place in Ekaterinburg. Local detectives followed the evidence and very quickly landed on Zykin's name. Later, investigators realized he had deliberately misled police. He knew they'd eventually track down the taxi driver. So he intentionally told him he was going to Ufa, while in reality he had gone straight to Ekaterinburg. On October 12, 2006, Elena Ovchkina returned from a work trip and went to her friend's apartment to pick up her 5-year-old daughter, who had been staying there. But no matter how many times she knocked, nobody answered. Elena panicked and called the police, but at first officers didn't take it seriously. For days, she kept coming back to that apartment door, hoping someone would answer. Finally, on the third day, police opened the apartment. What they found inside was something nobody there ever forgot. Almost every part of the apartment looked like a torture scene. Inside were the bodies of Svetlana Fursova, her 3-year-old daughter Yana, and Elena's 5-year-old daughter, Daria Ovchkina. Forensic experts later confirmed that all 3 victims had been sexually assaulted before they were killed, and the murders themselves were unbelievably violent. Even veteran homicide detectives admitted they had never seen anything that horrifying before. Investigators later discovered that the killer had also stolen all the money and savings from the apartment, around 400,000 rubles. Detectives immediately started questioning neighbors. One thing didn't make sense to anyone. How could someone torture and murder a grown woman and 2 children like that, without a single neighbor hearing anything? One of Svetlana's acquaintances later told police that she had recently been seeing a man named Oleg Zinoviev, a man who had rented an apartment in the same building. Neighbors said he would often stand outside Svetlana's window and call out to her so she could buzz him into the building. But police never got the chance to question that mysterious man, because right after the murders, he vanished. And just like before, investigators couldn't find a single fingerprint inside his apartment either. That was the moment detectives became certain they were dealing with the same serial killer again. Later, investigators discovered that while Zykin had been in the city, he had committed dozens of other crimes too. Most of the time, he targeted first-floor apartments and stole anything valuable he could find. Oleg almost never traveled by train or public transportation. He knew he could easily be recognized at stations, so he usually moved between cities by car instead. And there was something else investigators noticed. In almost every city, before committing the murders, he would first carry out a series of burglaries. It was almost like he was studying the city and learning how local police operated. After the murders in Ekaterinburg, Zykin attacked another woman in Orenburg. After sexually assaulting her, he killed her too. Then just 1 month later, in Kazan, he committed 2 more murders. The victims were a 49-year-old woman and a 16-year-old girl. At that point, police genuinely had no idea how to stop him. This was a man who constantly moved between cities, and every single time he managed to erase his trail almost perfectly. Police departments across nearby regions were sent not only his photo and physical description, but details about his methods too. He almost always targeted apartments on the first floor. And to avoid leaving fingerprints behind, he wrapped tape around his fingers before entering the crime scenes. After a while, reports started coming in from Ufa about a series of similar break-ins happening across different neighborhoods. There were no witnesses, no fingerprints either. In just 2 nights, more than 10 apartments in one area had been robbed. But investigators noticed something strange. Tiny pieces of adhesive tape had been left behind on window frames and door handles. Then, 2 days later, the burglar suddenly changed his method completely. This time, police only found traces of tape near the windows. At first, nobody understood why. But later, investigators realized Zykin hadn't even been entering the apartments anymore. Using simple tools and long tree branches, he was pulling valuables out through open windows and stealing them without ever stepping inside. Not long after that, another attack convinced police he had personally arrived in Ufa. One night, a young couple was walking home after seeing a movie. The husband stepped into a store to buy something, while his wife waited outside near their building. That's when a tall, heavily built man suddenly walked up behind her holding a large hunting knife. The woman started screaming. Luckily, her husband came out of the store at that exact moment and heard her yelling for help. The attacker immediately ran off. The woman was so shaken that she couldn't give police much of a description. She only remembered that the man was very tall, very strong, and wearing a black jacket. But there was one detail she couldn't forget. The hand holding the knife was missing part of a finger joint. That one detail was enough for police to know for sure. Oleg Zykin was in Ufa. His photo and description were immediately spread across the entire city, and authorities announced a reward for information leading to his arrest. Then, not long after that, another emergency call confirmed everyone's worst fear. The killer was definitely still inside the city. On the night of November 24th, Zykin attacked a 13-year-old girl named Irina Krasnobieva. Irina fought back hard, and that's when the attacker started stabbing her repeatedly. Her screams caught the attention of nearby pedestrians, forcing the killer to run away. Irina had been stabbed 9 times. She was rushed to the hospital immediately. For days, doctors fought to keep her alive. Even surgeons at the city children's hospital later said they had never seen injuries that severe before. The operation lasted for hours. During the entire surgery, Irina's parents sat outside the operating room waiting for a miracle. Finally, early the next morning, the doctors walked out and told them, "Your daughter survived. Her condition is stable for now." News that the serial killer had attacked a child spread across the city within hours. Investigators were convinced Zykin would now try to escape Ufa, means possible. So police immediately locked down the exits from the city. Patrols increased. Hundreds of vehicles were searched. And during all of that, Zykin was busy robbing 3 more apartments. Police were stunned by how bold he had become. The entire city was looking for him. His face was all over the news every single day. Newspapers kept printing his photo. But instead of hiding, he just kept committing more crimes like nothing was happening. Nobody could understand how a criminal this dangerous, with his face broadcast everywhere, was still walking freely around the city without being recognized. Then one day, it finally seemed like police had caught a break. A woman working at a local gas station called authorities and said she had just seen a man who looked exactly like Oleg Zykin. She told investigators that while the man was paying for cigarettes, she noticed something unusual when he reached out his hand. Part of the knuckle on his ring finger was missing. That detail alone convinced police it really was him. The witness also remembered something else. After buying the cigarettes, the man got into a blue Ford, and there was a woman sitting behind the wheel. At that moment, capturing Zykin wasn't even the police's main priority anymore. First, they needed to save that woman. A woman who most likely had no idea she was sitting next to one of Russia's most dangerous wanted killers. Every police unit was ordered not to stop the vehicle directly, and only report its movements instead. A special tactical team was sent in to handle the arrest. And every report warned officers about the same thing. The suspect was armed and could attack at any moment. Eventually, the car was surrounded and forced to stop. But when officers opened the door, there was only a terrified woman inside. Later, that woman explained how one of the country's most wanted serial killers had ended up in her car, and how he disappeared again. Her name was Maria. She told investigators she had known Oleg for a few months. The plan was supposedly to drive together to the city where he lived. But somewhere along the way, Oleg suddenly changed his mind and gave her a different address. Now, according to him, they were going to his friend's cabin instead. Maria had been talking to him for months and never once suspected that the man sitting beside her was the same killer whose face was all over the news every day. But during the drive, she started feeling uneasy and told him she didn't want to go to some stranger's house in the middle of nowhere. That's when Oleg pulled out a knife and pressed it against her throat. Later, Maria said she could tell just by looking into his eyes that if she refused, he would kill her without hesitation. Terrified, she agreed to keep driving wherever he told her to go. But at some point on the road, Zykin realized a car was following them. So he ordered Maria to turn onto a forest road. The moment she stopped the car, Oleg suddenly jumped out and disappeared into the woods. Maria immediately drove away in panic. After that, police shifted all their attention to the villages and rural areas nearby. They were convinced Zykin couldn't have gotten far. But after hours of searching through the darkness, detectives realized he had escaped again. And now the situation was even worse, because the killer knew police were right behind him now, tracking him step by step. Most people assumed he'd finally go into hiding for a while, but Zykin didn't even consider it. Just a few days later, another rape was reported. Then only days after that, another attempted murder. Detectives were certain it was only a matter of time before another body turned up somewhere in the city. By then, fear had completely taken over Ufa. At night, the streets became empty. People started locking their doors with multiple locks, placing wooden boards and metal bars across their windows, and nobody wanted to let their children outside alone anymore. Then, just one day after the previous attack, Zykin committed another incredibly bold crime. He climbed through the window of a first-floor apartment where two women were inside. He sexually assaulted both of them, but this time he didn't kill them, mostly because the victims had realized resisting would probably get them killed, so they focused only on surviving. Even so, the trauma was so severe that neither woman could remember much about the attacker's face or appearance afterward. The only thing both of them clearly remembered was the large knife. Police immediately knew this attack had to be Zykin again, and the pressure on investigators kept getting worse every single day. People across the city were openly accusing police of doing nothing, saying they couldn't stop a killer who was casually walking around the streets attacking people over and over again. Officers had started watching almost every suspicious-looking man they saw in public, and still nothing. Then finally, after years of failed attempts, one small moment changed everything. A woman living on Kremliovsky Street became suspicious of her new neighbor. Her name was Olesya Mikina. Later, Olesya told investigators that one day a strange man knocked on her door. He was holding a $100 bill and claimed he needed smaller cash because the exchange offices were closed and he wanted to buy groceries. But then he started asking strange questions. Questions like why her husband hadn't answered the door instead of her. Something about the conversation immediately felt wrong to her. And the $100 bill felt suspicious too, especially coming from a man who apparently didn't even have a job. After that, Olesya quietly started paying attention to her new neighbor's behavior. She noticed he almost never left the apartment during the day, only at night and usually just for a few hours at a time. The very next day, while inside a store, Olesya saw a wanted poster for Oleg Zykin. She immediately went home and called the police. And at that exact moment, while she was speaking to dispatchers, she looked out the window and saw Oleg entering his apartment with a young woman. Olesya called police again and begged them to hurry, because this time a girl's life might be in danger. A few minutes later, two police cars pulled up outside the building. Two officers stayed below near the apartment windows while three others quietly moved up the stairs. Everyone knew they had to act fast, because at any moment, Oleg could take the girl hostage. Luckily for police, the building was old, and forcing the apartment door open wasn't difficult. The moment officers got inside the apartment, they tackled Oleg to the ground and arrested him. And surprisingly, he didn't resist at all. If anything, he almost looked shocked that they had finally found him. Sitting on the table nearby was the same knife he had used to attack women. And the girl inside the apartment had absolutely no idea that if it hadn't been for one observant, suspicious neighbor, she probably would have become the serial killer's next victim within hours. And just like that, after 9 years of murder, escape, and terror, the story of the Black Tenant finally came to an end. After Zykin's arrest, Olesya, the woman who helped police catch him, received a reward. Whether that reward was really enough for helping stop one of Russia's most dangerous killers, people can decide for themselves. She was given 50,000 rubles in cash, another 10,000 in gifts, including a new carpet, a food processor, and a DVD player. During interrogations, Zykin confessed to 6 murders across cities like Ekaterinburg, Tyumen, and Chelyabinsk. He claimed that every time he arrived in a new city, he intended to start a quiet, normal life, but sooner or later he would lose control again and start looking for another victim. Over the years, Zykin traveled through 7 different regions of Russia and committed more than 100 crimes: burglaries, armed assaults, rapes, and murders. Later, investigators concluded that at least 9 people had been killed by him, and only 3 victims managed to survive. During interrogations, Zykin described his crimes in horrifying detail. He remembered almost all of his victims. Many of the interrogation recordings and crime scene reenactments were considered too disturbing to ever be publicly released. Because with complete calmness, the killer explained exactly what he had done to the 13-year-old girl and how he murdered the women. Investigators later said it actually wasn't surprising that women trusted him so easily. Oleg was extremely good at talking to people and making them feel safe around him. Some detectives who worked with him even admitted that he tried so hard to appear harmless and pitiful that at times they almost caught themselves feeling sorry for him. After his arrest, Zykin also started confessing to crimes police hadn't even known about before. For example, he admitted that in Ekaterinburg, he had murdered a young man by stabbing him through the heart with a screwdriver. He had met the victim through a laptop sale advertisement. But when he realized he couldn't afford the computer, he decided to take it for free instead. Another time, he claimed he had been drinking with an elderly neighbor and woke up the next morning to find her dead beside him. On November 18, 2006, Oleg Zykin spent his 30th birthday inside Detention Center No. 1 on Dostoevsky Street in Ufa. 2 days later, he took his own life inside his solitary confinement cell. A note was found next to his body. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life in prison." If he had survived, he most likely would have been sentenced to life imprisonment for the sheer number of crimes he committed. In the end, on December 30, 2006, the criminal case against Oleg Zykin was officially closed due to the suspect's death.